This is the second part of the three-part series on critical thinking. The second part is on intellectual standards. Critical thinking is thinking about your thinking to improve your thinking. We first saw this statement in the first part of the series. This is just a quick review. Critical thinking is the art of analyzing and assessing thinking in order to improve it. The awakening of the intellect to the study of itself and a system of thinking that opens up all other systems of thinking. Let's review the elements of thought. The element of thought reveals the logic, an objective to be figured out, some data or information, some experience of it, some reason for wanting to be figured out, which maps to the purpose or goal. Another element of thought is some question or problem we want to solve, the question at issue, essentially. Another element of thought is some initial sense of the object, whatever we take for granted. This maps to assumptions. Another element of thought, some ideas by which we are making sense of the object. This maps to the conceptual dimension. Another element, some drawing of conclusions about the object. This maps to the inferences we make. Number 7, what follows from our interpretation of the object. This maps to implications or consequences. Finally, some viewpoint from which we conceptualize the object maps to a point of view or a frame of reference. All of these 8 elements of thought must meet intellectual standards. Therefore, for each element, we must consider clarity, precision, relevance, accuracy, depth, breadth, logic, and fairness. These are the 8 intellectual standards that will be covered in this second part of the series. When we consider the figuring mind, we are focused on an object. This thing must have a logic, something to figure out. This maps to the elements of thought which must meet the intellectual standards. To evaluate our thinking, we must understand and apply intellectual standards. When we evaluate an element of thought, we must have clarity. By clarity, we mean the element is understandable and the meaning can be grasped. Another standard is accuracy. When we say an element of thought is accurate, we are saying it is free from errors or distortions. It is true. An element of thought must be precise. Precision implies that it is exact to the necessary level of detail. The element of thought is exact to the necessary level of detail. Relevance. When we say that an element of thought is relevant, it must relate to the matter at hand. Depth. When we say an element of thought has depth, we mean it contains complexities and multiple interrelationships. When we consider the breadth of an element of thought, we are considering the multiple viewpoints it encompasses. The logic of an element of thought implies or means that the parts make sense together. There are no contradictions. Significance. An element of thought must focus on the important, not trivial. And finally, fairness. An element of thought is fair if it is justifiable and not self-serving or one-sided. Let's look at questions we can ask ourselves in regards to the intellectual standards to determine if an element meets that intellectual standard. For clarity, we can ask ourselves, can we elaborate further? We can ask, can you give me an example? We can ask, could you illustrate what you mean? With accuracy, we can ask, how could we check on that? How could we find out if that is true? How could we verify or test that? For precision, we can ask, could you be more specific? Could you give me more details? Could you be more exact? For relevance, we can ask, how does that relate to the problem? How does that bear on the question? How does that help us with the issue? For depth, we can ask, what factors make this a difficult problem? What are some of the complexities of this question? What are some of the difficulties we need to deal with? Considering breadth, we can ask, do we need to look at this from another perspective? Do we need to consider another point of view? Do we need to look at this in other ways? The logic standard, we can ask, does all this make sense together? Does your first paragraph, for instance, fit with your last paragraph? Does what you say follow from the evidence? The significance standard, we can ask, is this the most important problem to consider? Is this the central idea to focus on? Which of these facts are most important? And finally, fairness. We can ask, do I have any vested interest in this issue? Am I sympathetically representing the viewpoints of others? We will now consider these intellectual standards with each of the elements of thought, beginning with purpose. We can consider this representation or this infographic of the elements of thought as our wheel of reason. Regarding purpose, all reasoning must have a purpose. Take time to state your purpose clearly. Distinguish your purpose from related purposes. Check periodically to be sure you are still on target. And choose significant and realistic purposes. When you're thinking about purpose, your purpose is your goal, your objective, what you are trying to accomplish. We also use the term to include functions, motives, and intentions. You should be clear about your purpose, and your purpose should be justifiable. When you think about your purpose, remember goal, objective, functions, motives, intentions. What do you want to accomplish? You can ask yourself, What is your, my, their purpose in doing such and such? What is the objective of this assignment? Should we question, refine, modify our purpose? What is the purpose of this meeting? What is your central aim in this line of thought? What is the purpose of education? These are examples of how we can ask questions to target the purpose. When we consider the clarity of our purpose, we want to ensure that it is understandable and that the meaning can be grasped. Questions you can ask are, could you elaborate further? Could you give me an example? Could you illustrate what you mean? The primary standards for purpose are clarity, significance, achievability, consistency, justifiability. The principle is, to reason well, you must clearly understand. That is our guiding principle. Clarity is the gateway standard. If a statement is unclear, we cannot determine whether it is accurate or relevant. In fact, we cannot tell anything about it because we don't yet know what it is. For example, the question, what can be done about the education system in America? This is unclear. It lacks clarity. In order to address the question adequately, we would need to have a clearer understanding of what the person asking the question is considering the problem to be. A clearer question might be, what can educators do to ensure that students learn the skills and abilities which help them function successfully on the job and in their daily decision making? When we consider the accuracy of our purpose, we want it to be free from errors or distortions. We want it to be true. Questions we could ask are, how could we check on that? How could we find out if that is true? How could we verify or test that? The primary standards for accuracy of purpose are clarity, significance, achievability, consistency, and justifiability. Our guiding principle is, to reason well, you must clearly understand. In considering accuracy, a statement can be clear but not accurate. We want clarity and accuracy. In this example, most dogs are over 300 pounds in weight. It's not accurate, but the statement is clear. When considering the precision of purpose, we want our purpose to be exact to the necessary level of detail. Questions we can ask are, could you be more specific? Could you give me more details? Could you be more exact? Primary standards are clarity, significance, achievability, consistency, and justifiability. The guiding principle, to reason well, you must clearly understand. A statement can be both clear and accurate, but lack precision, such as, Jack is overweight. We don't know how overweight Jack is, 1 pound or 500 pounds. The statement is clear and accurate, but it lacks precision. When considering the relevance of our purpose, we want it to relate to the matter at hand. Questions we can ask are, how does that relate to the problem? How does that bear on the question? How does that help us with the issue? Again, our guiding principle: to reason well, you must clearly understand. A statement can be clear, accurate, and precise, but not relevant to the question or issue at hand. For examples, students often think that the amount of effort they put into a course should be used in raising their grade in a course. Often, however, the effort does not measure the quality of student learning, and when this is so, effort is irrelevant to their appropriate grade. When considering the depth of our purpose, it must contain complexities and multiple interrelationships. What factors make this a difficult problem is one question we could ask. Another is, what are some of the complexities of this question? And another question we could ask is, what are some of the difficulties we need to deal with? A statement can be clear, accurate, precise, and relevant, but superficial. That is, it lacks depth. For example, the statement "just say no," which is often used to discourage children and teens from using drugs, is clear, accurate, precise, and relevant. Nevertheless, it lacks depth because it treats an extremely complex issue, the pervasive problem of drug use among our young, superficially. It fails to deal with the complexities of the issue. When considering the breadth of our purpose, we must consider whether or not it encompasses multiple viewpoints, which it should not be based solely on our viewpoint. Do we need to look at this from another perspective is a question we should ask. Do we need to consider another point of view? Do we need to look at this in other ways? These are questions we should ask to ensure the breadth of our purpose encompasses multiple viewpoints. A line of reasoning may be clear, accurate, precise, relevant, and deep, has depth, but lacks breadth. As in, for example, an argument from either the conservative or liberal standpoint, which gets deeply into an issue but only recognizes the insights of one side of the question. When considering the logic of our purpose, we want to make sure the parts make sense together, that there are no contradictions. We can ask, does all this make sense together? Does your first paragraph fit with your last? Does what you say follow from the evidence? When we think, we bring a variety of thoughts together into some order. When the combination of thoughts are mutually supporting and make sense in combination, the thinking is logical. When the combination is not mutually supporting, is contradictory in some sense, or does not make sense, the combination is not logical. When considering the significance of our purpose, we must ensure that it focuses on the important, not the trivial. We can ask, is this the most important problem to consider? Is this the central idea to focus on? Which of these facts are most important? When we reason through issues, we want to concentrate on the most important information in our reasoning and take into account the most important ideas or concepts. Too often, we fail in our thinking because we do not recognize that although many ideas may be relevant to an issue, it does not follow that all are equally important. In a similar way, we often fail to ask the most important questions and are trapped by thinking only in terms of superficial questions, questions of little weight. In other words, we too often focus on that which is pressing at the expense of focusing on that which is significant. When considering the fairness of our purpose, we must ensure that it is justifiable, not self-serving or one-sided. We can ask, do I have any vested interest in this issue? Am I sympathetically representing the viewpoints of the issue? Human think is often based in the direction of the thinker and what are the perceived interests of the thinker. Humans do not naturally consider the rights and needs of others on the same plane with their own rights and needs. We therefore must actively work to make sure we are applying the intellectual standard of fairness to our thinking. Since we naturally see ourselves as fair even when we are unfair, this can be very difficult. A commitment to fair-mindedness is a starting place. We have just looked at each of the intellectual standards applied to one element of thought, which is purpose. We shall also look at question as the second element of thought to review, information, interpretation, concepts, assumptions, implications, and point of view. So we have these remaining elements of thought to quickly review with each of the intellectual standards. We want to apply the intellectual standards to the element of thought, question, remembering that all reasoning is an attempt to figure something out, to settle some question, to solve some problem. Therefore, to apply the intellectual standards, we should state the question at issue clearly and precisely, express the question in several ways to clarify its meaning, break the question into sub-questions if possible, and we should distinguish questions that have definitive answers from those that are a matter of opinion or that require multiple viewpoints. The question lays out the problem or issue and guides our thinking. When the question is vague, our thinking will lack clarity and distinctness. Questions which help us target the question at hand. What is the question I am trying to answer? What important questions are embedded in this issue? Is there a better way to put the question? Is this question clear? Is it complex? Am I not sure exactly what you are asking? Therefore, could you explain it better? The question in my mind is this: how do you see the question? What kind of question is this? Historical, scientific, ethical, political, economic? These are questions we can ask to help target the question at hand. We must apply the intellectual standards to the element information, remembering that all reasoning is based on data, information, and evidence. You should restrict your claims to those supported by the data you have. You should search the information that opposes your position as well as information that supports it. Make sure that all information used is clear, accurate, and relevant. Make sure you have gathered sufficient amount of information. Information includes the facts, data, evidence, or experiences we use to figure things out. It does not necessarily imply accuracy or correctness. Questions that we can ask to help us target the information are: what information do I need to answer this question? What data are relevant to this problem? Do we need to gather more information? Is this information relevant to our purpose or goal? On what information are you basing that comment? What experience convinced you of this? Could your experience be distorted? How do we know this information, data, for example, testimony, is accurate? How have we left out any important information that we need to consider? These are questions that we can ask to help us target the information. Applying intellectual standards to the element of thought, interpretation. All reasoning contains inferences or interpretations by which we draw conclusions and give meaning to data. We should only infer what the evidence implies. We should check inferences for their consistency with each other, and we should identify assumptions underlying our inferences. Inferences are interpretations or conclusions you come to. Inferring is what the mind does in figuring something out. Inferences should logically flow from the evidence. Infer no more or less than what is implied in the situation. Questions to help us check our inferences. What conclusions am I coming to? Is my inference logical? Are there other conclusions I should consider? Does this interpretation make sense? Does our solution necessarily follow from our data? We could ask, how did you reach that conclusion? What are you basing your reasoning on? We could ask, is there an alternative, plausible conclusion? Given all the facts, what is the best possible conclusion? And finally, how shall we interpret these data? These are questions that we can ask to help us check our inferences to ensure they meet the intellectual standards. Applying the intellectual standards to the element of thought concept. All reasoning is expressed through and shaped by concepts and ideas. We should identify key concepts and explain them clearly. We should consider alternative concepts or alternative definitions of concepts. And we should make sure we are using concepts with precision. Concepts are ideas, theories, laws, principles, or hypotheses we use in thinking to make sense of things. We should be clear about the concepts we are using and use them justifiably. Questions we can ask about concepts. What idea am I using in my thinking? Is this idea causing problems for me or for others? I think this is a good theory, but could you explain it more fully? What is the main hypothesis you are using in your reasoning? Are you using this term in keeping with established usage? What main distinctions should we draw in reasoning through this problem. And finally, what idea is this author using in his or her thinking? Is there a problem with it? These are questions that we can ask about our concept or concepts to ensure they meet intellectual standards. Applying intellectual standards to an element of thought, the element of assumptions. Keep in mind, all reasoning is based on assumptions. We should clearly identify our assumptions and determine whether they are justifiable. We should consider how our assumptions are shaping our point of view. Assumptions are beliefs that you take for granted. They usually operate at the subconscious or unconscious level of thought. Make sure that you are clear about your assumptions and they are justified by sound evidence. Questions we can ask to check our assumptions. What am I assuming or taking for granted? Am I assuming something I shouldn't? What assumption is leading me to this conclusion? What is, for example, the policy, the strategy, or explanation we are assuming? What exactly do sociologists, historians, mathematicians take for granted? What is being presupposed in this theory? What are some important assumptions I make about my roommate, my friends, my parents, my instructors, my country? Applying intellectual standards to implications. All reasoning leads somewhere or has implications and consequences. We should trace the implications and consequences that follow from our reasoning. We should search for negative as well as positive implications, and we should consider all possible consequences. Think through your implications and consequences. Implications are claims or truths that logically follow from other claims or truths. Implications follow from thoughts. Consequences follow from actions. Implications are inherent in your thoughts, whether you see them or not. The best thinkers think through the logical implications in a situation before acting. Questions we can ask: if I decide to do X, what things might happen? If I decide not to do X, what things might happen? We could ask, what are you implying when you say that? What is likely to happen if we do this versus that? We could ask, what are you implying? Why are you implying that? How significant are the implications of this decision? What, if anything, is implied by the fact that a much higher percentage of poor people are in jail than wealthy people? This is a question we could ask to determine the implications in the thought and the consequences of the actions. Applying intellectual standards to an element of thought, the point of view. All reasoning is done from some point of view. We should identify our point of view. We should seek other points of view and identify their strengths as well as weaknesses. We should strive to be fair-minded in evaluating all points of view. Point of view is literally the place from which you view something. It includes what you are looking at and what you are seeing it, and the way you are seeing it. Make sure you understand the limitations of your point of view and that you fully understand and have considered other relevant viewpoints. Questions that we can ask: how am I looking at this situation? Is there another way to look at it that I should consider? What exactly am I focused on, and how am I seeing it? Is my view the only reasonable view? What does my point of view ignore? Have you ever considered the way, for example, Japanese, Muslims, South Americans, etc., view this? Which of these possible viewpoints makes the most sense given the situation? Am I having difficulty looking at this situation from a viewpoint with which I disagree? What is the point of view of the author of this story? Do I study viewpoints that challenge my personal beliefs? These are questions that we can ask to ensure we are applying intellectual standards to the element point of view. In this second part of the three-part series, we have covered intellectual standards applied to the elements of thought which were first introduced in part 1 of this series. Part 3, the final part of this series, will focus on intellectual virtues.